Hey,
Yeah,
Lisa, how are you?
Hi,
I like your
Linda.
background there. It's good.
Thank you.
So actually, speaking of candles, because I'm actually, I know you can't tell because it looks like I'm in the wilderness, but
Oh,
I am actually at home, and I realized the one thing I forgot to bring from work were candles. Is there any chance either of you happen to have a candle set anywhere nearby?
like Shabbat candles? Yes, I
Yeah.
do.
Oh, Linda, could you do me a favor? Oh, that'd be amazing.
Yeah, we go get them. Let me get the candles.
Great.
I do
Otherwise,
too.
Lisa, we
Beat
could
me
just
to
use your
it.
background. We can look. You can all do it. I mean, that's the thing. This is, so we're streaming out. I'm sure the throngs are watching, but this is always one of those services that historically is sort of sparsely attended. So I was kind of hoping that'd be the case because then we can teach a little bit as we do stuff, which will be nice.
Oh, it's lovely. I have to go in the other room and get them. I'll be right
I
back.
have
Yeah,
these.
totally.
I'm
Take
gonna
your
switch
time. We're gonna
rooms.
we'll give a couple minutes.
Okay.
We'll Lisa get set up. Both of you guys can do some lighting. It'll be great. Oh,
Okay,
awesome.
I'll be right back, guys.
You like them now?
Good. Hold on one second, Linda. We'll wait for Lisa to come back and all that. But thank you, Linda, coming to the rescue.
You're welcome.
It's good.
Yeah.
How was your trip, by the way?
Oh, it was wonderful. I did watch. We were away over Rosh Hashanah,
Right.
but I did watch the service though.
Well, that's the great thing, right? We came with you.
I know. I brought you.
Amazing.
We had a wonderful time. We were in Myrtle Beach.
Oh, very nice. How was the weather?
It was gorgeous. I think we had like one day of rain, and we drove down.
Wow.
All of us
Wow.
went. We drove down.
How long is that drive?
It's about 16 hours. But
That's how it felt like to me yesterday. I had to drive to help Cantor Lauren do a wedding yesterday in Verona, New Jersey.
Oh, wow.
And it took me only like 3 hours to get there, but getting home took probably closer to 5.5. Like just getting from, I guess, where like the Meadowlands is to the bridge was an hour and 15 minutes easily. And then once I got across the bridge, the Cross Bronx, just from there to the Throgs Neck, was another, I don't know, hour and 15. I literally had to pull off at Douglaston and get something to eat because I couldn't do it anymore.
Yeah, well, we had to stop. We had the dog. We had the dogs with us too, so we had to stop every once in a while as well. But it is just getting out to the island. If you lived up in the city or you lived in Nassau County, it's no big deal.
Right.
But just getting from there to here.
It almost feels like wandering in the wilderness of all things, right? That's yeah, we tied that in. All right, so this is great. So we have both Linda and Lisa who are going to light candles where they're at. I'll do the blessing. You guys do the lighting. Okay. And just so you guys know, we are streaming at the moment, but then we'll just take it easy. We're gonna move through things. I'll explain some stuff. It'll be nice.
Okay, so
whenever you're ready. Whenever you're ready.
I did. Oh, yeah.
Okay, and if anybody is watching on the streaming, we're on page 384. This is the blessing where we light our Yom Tov candles.
I had a stubborn match.
Oh, I bought this 300.
I'm very grateful that we have those torch things at the temple or at the church these days. Because otherwise, that was always the risk at the beginning of every service was, will it light or will we light ourselves?
Either the match or the wick. Okay.
Right, exactly. Good.
All right, there we go. I'm lit.
You're lit? Okay, Lisa, you're lit?
Yeah.
Okay, beautiful. And if you're at home and you have candles, you should join us as well. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lehadlik ner shel yom tov. Very good. All right, so guys, before we get started with the service, since it's just us friends. Well, no, actually, I was just saying to Lisa that this actually historically is a service that does not often get a lot of people, mostly because the Erev service of a holiday like Sukkot is a very sort of condensed service in the first place. And if it's not Shabbat, even more so. But like, the morning service, sorry, it's a Marsha's coming, it tends to be, and you never know, somebody might be watching otherwise, but it seemed to me that actually, since we were going to have a smaller group to begin with, I could just explain a couple of the differences between a festival service like this and a regular evening service. And I'll try to do it in 5 minutes or less. Marsha, how you doing?
Hey, Marsha.
Hey, Marsha.
All right. So we'll leave the mics open for now. And then when I start doing the actual service, we'll mic off. So, basically, all of our services start from the simplest form and then tend to get more complex, or they tend to have entire sections, in some cases, replaced. So, for example, an evening normal evening service, right? If it was just a Tuesday night, okay, generally speaking, you would start at either the Chatzi Kaddish or the Baruch Hu, right? The Baruch Hu is the sort of formal call to prayer. And then, just like we're familiar with actually on a Friday night, there are two blessings before the Shema, and then blessings that come after the Shema. So the first two will seem familiar, and then you'll kind of sort of pay attention to where that continues on. And then you have Hashkivenu. You don't have Vishamru because that's a prayer that's done only on Shabbat. So sometimes a holiday and Shabbat coincide with each other, and that's why you have to pay close attention to what you include and what you don't include. And it really has to do again with whether it's just a regular day of the week or whether it's a Friday night, and obviously it changes a lot. The Amidah prayer, which we normally do and we do silently, has a few special inserts for when you get to Sukkot. And the Kiddush, the blessing over wine, is extended, and that one is done basically similarly for all of the festivals that are, Sukkot, Pesach, and Shavuot. And also this really interesting holiday, which we'll get to next week, which we call either Shmini Atzeret, Simchas Torah, or Shmini Atzeret, Simchas Torah, depending on who you are. But I'll save that teaching for next week because we're going to get kind of ahead of ourselves. So we'll do, our sort of regular service, and I have a little bit of a Sukkot-related teaching that I wanted to share with you guys, which hopefully you'll find interesting. But mostly just, the main idea of a holiday like Sukkot, first and foremost, is about gratitude. And you have to imagine, right? I know it's sort of funny looking having me in the background with my little ancient version of a sukkah here, right? But and Sukkot, I was just, talking to our kids in the Hebrew school, is on the one hand is a very intuitive holiday, right? It makes sense in a sort of historical human way because it's a harvest holiday. It's a holiday that's about, gathering people together. It's a holiday that's also sort of historical in that it's trying to remind us of what it's like, right, to be living in a temporary kind of dwelling. But the sort of descriptions of it in the Torah are actually fairly limited. We really basically are told you are meant to dwell in booths. Sukkot is the word for booth, right? Thing that we see behind us for 7 days. We're supposed to, avoid doing work or things like that in the beginning and the end of the holiday, and in the middle are able to do more and more different kinds of things. But by and large, it doesn't give us a whole lot. And so it's really actually where the rabbis eventually get involved, where they take some of these ideas that are presented in the Torah and they really begin to expand upon them. And if you think about it, aside from the fact that it just makes a certain kind of sense, the rabbis are really good at doing that for all sorts of things. It's especially important when you think about the fact that most of the rabbis, when we're talking about, are post-destruction, right? Even though they existed prior to the destruction of the temple, this is really, when you're talking about the Mishnah, it's 200 CE, right? We're talking about the Gemara, the latter part of the Talmud, you're talking about closer to 500 CE and a little bit beyond. At that point, right, the Jews are not really living in the land of Israel, right? They're not tilling their own land. There's no temple to return to. So the rabbis are really trying very hard to construct a circumstance in which there's a way for people who are disconnected from the story and the narrative and the original purposes, and yet at the same time feeling a need to sort of spiritually connect to the identity of it. And so, as the rabbis do, they develop both customs and laws and all sorts of things. They call a number of different kinds of things that help, for those of us, especially, they couldn't have conceived of how distant, right, the human being living in 2021 would be from their own food, right, or what it means to actually grow and cultivate and harvest, and the gratitude that inevitably develops from that kind of procedure, right? For most of us, I would say, I'll just put it in the eye, right? I went grocery shopping earlier today. Gratitude was not the thing on my mind as I was shopping, right? Especially after I paid the bill, very much not, right? It felt the exact opposite, right? It's disconnected. But Sukkot is a holiday where really we're meant to reconnect to the things that actually are really not part of our regular existence, right? Harvests, being outside, being vulnerable in that kind of way. And the temporary nature of it is key, right? That we're told, this is a period of time, 7 days plus, but that's it, right? We're not told to live this way forever. We're not supposed to live in the past exclusively. And just because we can't necessarily do some of the things that Sukkot would have originally been about, doesn't mean that we can't still find ways to make it meaningful for us. And so it actually is one of those things where Sukkot has developed into such an interesting holiday, in some ways so far beyond whatever its original idea or intention might have been, because we had to work really hard to imagine ourselves as living the way that our ancestors lived. And today, I think actually it's probably our most creative holiday, right? If you think about it, right? Every sukkah ends up being different. Decorations are different. When you go to different places in the world, obviously different building materials, right? Obviously, this is an extreme example, right? But that background is the background that would be familiar to anybody who spent any time certainly wandering around in the Sinai or in the Negev, right? It's going to look a lot like that, very sparse, very open. And this is not perhaps the most prototypical of sukkahs that you will see, walking around in Jerusalem these days, right? A lot of times they're made out of metal poles and things of that nature. Right? The idea is, well, also it's easier in Israel to a large degree because at this point in the year it's still pretty warm in most parts of the country. They're not really generally yet into very, very rainy kinds of things, which will come. Here is a different story, but in Israel, people live they spend the whole week. That's really the idea, is that you're supposed to really live in it, not just eat in it, but really, really lay shave, right? To sit down, in many cases, to sleep. And so people will build these very extravagant looking sukkahs all over the place. And they ultimately, right, if you walk up and down the streets of Jerusalem, you will see them parked outside of people's homes, on mirpesets, on people's porches. And one of the great things about the holiday, I was just talking to kids about it at Hebrew school, right, is that it's the one that embodies the most probably hachnasat orchim, the idea that we are meant to welcome in people. And that's what unfortunately makes it really hard, right? This is one of these holidays that you look forward to because you can be together with people and be in the sukkah with them and all of that. And I think we've done a pretty good job of translating a lot of things into the virtual world. Sukkot is really tough that way. There is something to be missed. But the way I look at it, especially for this year, is that's why tonight. Oh, that's nice that Sue and Larry are watching. I tell them thank you. That's good to know that they're watching on the YouTube.
Oh, you can see.
Yeah. That basically to take this opportunity to learn a little bit, right, and to where I can to teach a few things so that next year, God willing, in our beautiful shul with a a new sukkah and all those kinds of things, that we'll be able to come in and again with that even greater sense of gratitude. So anyway, that was my preamble for the evening so far. Nicole, you didn't miss much, but I said this is always one of those services where we can take it a little bit slower, and there isn't actually as much to do in the service itself. So you guys can just sit back and relax now. I'm going to mute everybody, and I'll kind of take over, and then we'll get to a little bit of teaching towards the end after the Amida. Okay. Good. All right. So forgive me for the muting. Let me put me on the spotlight. Okay. Everybody see me, hear me? Okay. Good. Okay, so if you have your Siddur, you have your prayer book, we're in a slightly different part of the prayer book, as I explained. And we're going to turn to the Baruch Hu, which is on page 394. Okay, and again, your choice at home, whether to rise or to stay seated for whichever parts of it feel most appropriate. Just question, I put this on mostly for sort of humor as a background, but I could take it off if it's distracting. I don't know if it's distracting people, but maybe I will take it off. Just forgive the actual background of the room here. It's a little bit busy. Okay. Baruch Hu et Adonai Hamborach. Baruch Adonai Hamborach leolam va'ed. Please be seated. We're now on page 396, and we're going to read together in English at the bottom of the page. Praised are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who speaks the evening into being, skillfully opens the gates, thoughtfully alters the time and changes the seasons, and arranges the stars in their heavenly courses according to plan. You are creator of day and night, ruling light away from darkness and darkness from light, transforming day into night and distinguishing one from the other. Adonai Tzvaot is your name. Ever-living God, may you reign continually over us into eternity. Praised are you, Adonai, who brings on evening. Uma'avir yom u'mevi laila, uma'avdil ben yom u'ben laila, Adonai tzvaot shemo. El chai v'kayam tamid yimlach aleinu le'olam va'ed, Baruch atah Adonai, Amari v'aravim. We'll turn now to page 398, and we'll read together in English at the bottom of the page. Everlasting love, you offered your people Israel by teaching us Torah and mitzvot, laws and precepts. Therefore, Adonai our God, when we lie down and when we rise up, We will meditate on your laws and your commandments. We will rejoice in your Torah forever. Day and night we will reflect on them, for they are our life, and doing them lengthens our days. Never remove your love from us. Praise to you, Adonai, who loves your people Israel. כי הם חיינו ואורך ימינו, והם נגי יומם ולילה. בעבדך אל תסיר ממנו לעולמים, ברוך אתה אדוני, אוהב עמו ישראל. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Okay, please join me on page 402. ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך, והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך, ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך ובשוכבך ובקומך, וקשרתם לאות על ידיך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך, למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותיי, והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם, אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים, להיות לכם לאלוהים, אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אדוני אלוהיכם אמת. Now let's read on page 403. I like this. Love your God with every heartbeat, with every breath, with every conscious act. Keep in mind the words I command you today and teach them to your children. Talk about them at work, whether you are tired or you are rested. Let these words guide the work of your hands. Keep them in the forefront of your vision. Do not leave them at the doorway of your house or outside your gate. These words are reminders to do all of my mitzvot, so that you can be holy for God. I am Adonai your God. I led you out of Egypt to become your God. I am Adonai your God. We'll turn now to page 404 and then on to 45 pretty quickly, or 406. Umalchuto v'ratzon kiblu aleihem Moshe uMiriam u'bnei Yisrael lechanu shira b'simcha rabba v'amru chulam. We'll turn to page 406, Michamocha. Michamocha ba'elim Adonai, Michamocha nehedar b'kodesh, Norah tehilot osef elem. Malchutecha ra'uvanecha bokeam lifnei Moshe u'Miriam zeli anu ve'amru Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed. V'nemar kifad Adonai et Yaakov u'golo miyad chazak mimenu Baruch atah Adonai Gal Yisrael. Let there be love and understanding among us. Let peace and friendship be our shelter from life's storms. Eternal God, help us to walk with good companions, to live with hope in our hearts and eternity in our thoughts, that we may lie down in peace and rise up, waiting to do your will. We turn to page 408 at the very top, Hashkivenu. Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu leshalom, v'hamidenu shomreinu lechaim. Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu leshalom, v'hamidenu shomreinu lechaim. Ushmor tzeteinu uvoeinu lechaim u'shalom me'ata v'ad olam. Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu leshalom ve'hamidenu shomreinu lechaim. Blessed are you, Adonai, guardian of Israel, whose shelter of peace is spread over us, over all your people Israel, and over Yerushalayim. We turn now, and this is where I was saying before, in our normal Friday night service, we would go right into what's on page 410, the Shamru, right? Because that is a celebration of, it's part of our Shabbat liturgy. Since it's not Shabbat, we replace it with another phrase, which you can find on page 411. It's the second one down from the top of the page where it says on Shabbat and weekdays. So this means that if it's Shabbat, you say this regardless. And if it's a weekday, this is the only part of any of the things on this page that you would say. Looks like actually it's on the bottom of 410 as well. And this is a quote actually from Torah itself. As you see, one of the great things about our prayer book is that it will often give a citation, especially when there's Torah text that's being quoted, because it's not always obvious if you're not familiar with it. But this is probably not, at least seemingly, one of the most important lines in the Torah. But at the same time, it is the formal proclamation that we have what are called Moadei Adonai. The way it's usually translated is an appointed festival. Moed is the sort of the terminology that the Torah uses for festival days, and we get an interesting phrase which alters things slightly for us. Remember that a holiday like Sukkot, a holiday like Pesach are multiple day holidays, right? They begin and they end. They're 7 days. So if one looked at it as like Shabbat and treated it like Shabbat, you would have a 7-day period in which you wouldn't be able to work, you wouldn't be able to kindle lights, you wouldn't be able to travel, right? All the things that you sort of associate. So what the rabbis have ultimately come up with is what they refer to as Chol HaMoed, okay? And Chol HaMoed refers to basically days that are technically part of the festival, but they are intermediary days, and the days in between, which allow you to do more things than you would otherwise be allowed to do on Shabbat, while still being at least somewhat restricted and still focused on the holiday. And sometimes it's really more just in the affirmative, right? That you still have obligations and mitzvot to follow during those intervening days, but you can go about, taking care of yourself, making food, doing the things that you need to do. So chol is basically the word in Hebrew and, in rabbinical thought that describes basically everything that is not sacred. Okay, so for Havdalah, for example, what we sing is Mavdil ben Kodesh lechol. Mavdil means to separate, ben Kodesh, which means from the sanctified things and times, lechol, from everything else. Okay, so Chol HaMoed is sort of a weird combination of saying it's on the one hand, like every other day, and at the other time, it's also a Moed, it's also an appointed time as well. So you exist in this sort of weird liminal space between normal and yet festival at the same kind of time, which is why you got to love the rabbis. They're remarkably, interesting in that kind of way, coming up with all those kinds of things. So anyway, for a Chol HaMoed situation or a Moed situation like this, where you're not on Shabbat, we say, Vayadeber Moshe et Moedei Adonai el bnei Yisrael. And Moses declared the appointed festivals of Adonai to the people of Israel. And as I said, this is a short and direct kind of service. We go right from there into the Amidah, but this is a festival Amidah, so we'll turn to page 468 instead of our normal page. And as always, we'll begin together and then we'll continue silently. I'll turn my screen off just for a minute while I daven my prayer as well, and invite you all to take your time and to really work through the liturgy and to see and to pay close attention to where there is difference and where it's similar. And I'll just give you a little bit of the answer ahead of time. The beginning part of the Amidah, the end part of the Amidah will seem almost identical, if not entirely identical. There are only some changes that happen actually during the day service, which we will do on Shmini Atzeret, where we change one thing. But the main difference is, if you look on page 478, if you look, or 479, maybe more helpful if you're following in the English. If you look at the top left of the page, you'll see there's this great little rundown you see on the top there. It just kind of gives you a sense of where you are within the Amidah. These are all the different sections that make it up, right? So Avot ve'imahot, Gvurot, and Kedusha, for the most part, are identical to a regular, either weekday night or a Friday night scenario if it's Shabbat. And everything that follows, Avodah, Hodah, Shalom, and Tfilat Halev, again, all basically the same. The main difference is the centerpiece here, which is called Kedushat Hayom. And Kedushat Hayom means sanctification of the day. So we can imagine, right, that today is not the same as Pesach. It's not the same as Shavuot. It's not the same as Shmini Atzeret. It's Sukkot. So we basically, instead of the rabbis concocting a different prayer for each of those days or times of the year, they keep the basics of the prayer the same, except if you look on page 478, you will see in English, actually, right, it has a little indent, and then it says Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, or Atzeret, Shmini Atzeret, Simchas Torah. Right. So depending on which holiday you are in, you add this particular word or phrase in, which indicates which holiday you are a part of. But everything else essentially remains identical. So you have to really sort of pay close attention to these little places, because that's where it really becomes unique and special and all those good things. So again, we'll bounce backwards now to page 468. We'll begin our Amidah together, and then we'll all continue silently for a few moments at our own pace in our own way. And I'll probably just turn my screen off for a few minutes, just so I'll have a little bit of private prayer time, rare as it may be. Adonai sefatai tiftach ufi agi tehilatecha. Adonai, open up my lips that my mouth may declare your praise. Okay, again, take your own time, and when you're finished, you can be seated if you're standing, and we'll gather back together in a couple of minutes. Ose shalom bimromav, uyase shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'al kol yoshvei tevel. Yahase shalom, Yahase shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yahase shalom, Yahase shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. So we're going to turn now to page 371, as we always do, to make space to offer our Misha Berach, our healing prayer, and especially on a holiday like Sukkot, which again is one that we tend to think of really our family and our friends and gathering and all those things that we think of, certainly the closest ones to us who are in need of healing, and we extend outwards also to a world in need of healing. If you do have any specific names that you'd like to share, you're welcome to put them into the chat. Anybody who's watching on the stream can certainly say them at home. But if not, just simply to hold our loved ones in our heart. And let's join together on page 371 in the middle of the page, and we'll sing the Misha Berach together. Misha Berach Avotenu Mekor habracha leimotenu. May the source of strength, who blessed the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say, Amen. Mi sheberach imotenu, mekor habracha lavotenu. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say, Amen. Okay, Chag Sameach, everybody. I'm going to switch back to my more appropriate background here for my little teaching. Got to be in my sukkah. So here's what I'm going to do, and by all means, anybody who's on the actual Zoom with us, if you don't want to be seen or interact with, by all means, keep your video and your mic off. There's no judgments here. Anybody who wants to, I was hoping for a little bit more of a give and take piece here. So I'm just going to put you in the gallery. And so Lisa, Linda, you're welcome to jump in anywhere if you'd like to. But I'm going to just share screen quickly here, just to show a little bit of a text I want to talk about tonight. First, before I do that, just a little bit again of context. Sort of pop quiz. If you were wondering how to celebrate the holiday of Sukkot, right? You didn't know, you didn't have any idea. Where would you go? What would be your best source, you think, for figuring out what to do for Sukkot? Okay, and you can answer anything that you got. Linda, Lisa, anything, and you can unmute yourself freely at the moment. Lisa, what do you think?
I often use the Chabad site and also that app. I can't remember the name of it.
There's one that's My Jewish Learning too.
Jewish Learning, excellent, right? Chabad's website, very helpful, full of good information. Nicole, I don't know if you've got anything that, is your sort of go-to kind of source in a modern time, and you could unmute yourself, Nicole, if you want to.
Safaria, that was it.
Safaria is great.
Yeah.
Safaria is excellent. Safaria is really amazing. Nicole, what about you?
I'll sometimes ask a friend who's more observant than I am how they do such and such.
Okay, very good answers. All of these good answers, right? And the truth is that My Jewish Learning, Safaria are the equivalent of basically calling your friend, and asking them the question to some degree, or your rabbi or whatever it might be. So the answer is that in a modern time, this is actually a sort of easy thing to do, right? You can go to virtually any reputable Jewish website, and they will give you not just the details, they'll often give you a recording, a transliterated version of it, pictures, histories, commentaries, all the things you could possibly want. But of course, we know that this is something of a very modern construct. And really, even we can remember prior to 1996, right? And probably for most of us later than that, okay, you weren't going to the internet certainly to find answers to things, right? So chances are you would go, as Nicole said, right? You'd go to somebody in your life who is knowledgeable about these kinds of things, and you'd ask them. But if you ask them where they would go, okay, what they would most likely tell you is that the standard place to understand the common practice, and when I say common, that's always a loaded term, right? The common practice of, let's say, sort of mainline Orthodox halachic practice, you would go to a book that's called the Shulchan Aruch. Okay, and the Shulchan Aruch is basically a significant, very significant code of Jewish law that was compiled by a rabbi named Yosef Karo. If I remember correctly, it's 16th century, maybe 17th century. And it, to this day, is still really the major source of most ideas of how to do almost everything one can think of in a Jewish life, right? From the most mundane to the most spiritual. And it's designed in such a way that you can pick it up and say, okay, I'm looking for information on Sukkot. You go to the section on Sukkot, you find it, you open it up, and you find your answer to most kinds of things, okay? But the Shulchan Aruch, as I said, it's already, we're talking late 16th, 17th century, things of that nature. So we're already pretty far down the road. If we went back a little bit further in time, okay, we might go to Maimonides, right? We might go to Maimonides' Mishnah Torah. We might go, and Margaret, I don't know if you had something to add. I may have accidentally just muted you again. You're welcome to jump in anywhere. Okay. Okay. waving off. That's good. Right, that those are sort of your standard, what you call Sforim, sort of holy books that you would go to as a resource. But all of that is really building actually out of, if we keep going further back, right, the Talmud, made up of the Mishnah and the Gemara. And so really the first instances that we get for fulfilling the mitzvot of what's described in the Torah and expanded a little bit in the latter books of the Tanakh, for the most part, our practices around Sukkot really come from the Mishnah and the Gemara, what we call the Talmud primarily. Mm-hmm. And what we should know, again, about rabbinic thought and about the Mishnah and Gemara is that there's a lot of disagreement, right? What we eventually get to, when you get to the Shulchan Aruch, the whole idea of having a code of law is that you take what's this big and you try to make it this big, right? So that you can find something and know what to do and know how to light your candles and know how to clean your house, whatever you have to do, and do it quickly. But if you're really looking for the whole conversation and you want to understand how you got to that point, right? How it is that we know that buying a sukkah from the Sukkah Project is a legitimate thing to be able to do, you have to go much further early on and you have to go to some discussion. So the reality is we would need a whole semester to even begin to scratch the surface of the particular nature of how one is about to build a sukkah or allowed to build a sukkah, out of what things, how many walls, what material is allowed above us. I was teaching the kids, the favorite thing of rabbis to teach is about the elephant as a side of the sukkah, that there is legitimately a conversation in the Talmud about whether or not you could use a living animal as a side of a sukkah. And in the case of an elephant, the answer is in some cases a technical yes, believe it or not. And that really the only reason why it's not going to work is because the elephant could conceivably get up and walk away. And so therefore, the only way that it's conceivably allowed is if one restrains said elephant, or worse yet, that the elephant unfortunately has passed away. Those are the only circumstances where it works. But that is literally in the Talmud. There's, conversations that happen, and there's a lot of minutia around it. And of course, there's a humor to it, and there's even a bit of absurdity to it. But there is also a lot of really interesting discourse and debate around actually pretty significant questions about really what is this sukkah thing, and how are you meant to understand it, and what limitations, if any, are there placed on it. So I want to just focus actually tonight on one very specific instance that comes from the Mishnah. I'm going to put it up on the screen. Hopefully you can see it. I know maybe a little bit small. Let's see if I can zoom in a little. Okay. So this comes from a section of the Talmud, which there's 63 tractates in the Talmud. One whole tractate of the 63 is called Masechet Sukkah. Okay. So it is just a section really just dealing primarily with the questions related to Sukkot, to the Sukkah itself, etc. Like most parts of the Talmud, it's very rarely ever just one topic. And a lot of times there is a lot of interaction around a lot of different kinds of topics, etc. So here I want to describe one of the many, many, many disagreements or debates, I should say, probably is better. Machloket is what we would say in Hebrew, between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, right? The two great houses and the two great rabbinic leaders who led those houses of learning in their era, right? In the pre-Mishnaic era, and they're kind of being reported to here. So they get into an argument about actually something that may seem sort of obvious once you think about it, right? Which is, well, I maybe don't want to have to build a sukkah every year, right? It's a lot of work. I might, especially for rabbi, I just finished a lot of work over the last couple of weeks, right? It would be really nice if all I had to do was to go out into my backyard and there'd be a sukkah already waiting for me. Okay, so not so simple as that. Okay, so here we get into the disagreement about is that a viable option? So with regard to an old sukkah, which we'll define in a second, Beit Shammai, who just again, for those that don't remember, Beit Shammai in essence loses the vast majority of disagreements with Beit Hillel. The rabbis and halacha as a whole tend to follow the practices of Beit Hillel and his students, largely because Hillel was actually more lenient, right? You might think that you'd want to go with the more stringent. There's a midrash that talks about the fact that actually Beit Shammai's will come into effect when the Mashiach comes, because at that point, the world will be expecting a lot more of us and we need to be more exacting and all of that. But in a frail world in which we live, right, in which most of us are not maybe always on our best game, Hillel is generally the way that the rabbis go because Hillel is more accommodating of more leniency in various kinds of ways. Now, that's a very big oversimplification of their debates and their arguments, etc. But that's one way of sort of understanding kind of who these guys are. Okay, so as we might imagine, in the question of whether somebody can use quote unquote an old sukkah, Shammai says no. Okay, it's not fit, and it's not fit for the mitzvah of sukkah. And Beit Hillel says the opposite. Right? They deem that it is in fact fit. It's usable. Okay, and which is considered an old sukkah. So what, first of all, are we talking about? What does it mean an old sukkah? So it is, according to this, any booth that one established 30 days or more prior to the beginning of the Sukkot festival. So if, for example, according to this conversation, I were to have built my sukkah in July, okay, according to Beit Shammai, what? Would it be acceptable or not? No, right? And if it were Hillel, it would be acceptable, okay? Now, without expressly, here's the caveat, okay? And one thing I should just point out about this translation, this is a wonderful translation of the Steinsaltz Hebrew English Talmud, which is wonderful, is the stuff in bold is what's actually in the Hebrew right here. The stuff not bolded is basically years and years, generations worth of commentary that the editor, who was a remarkable, Adin Steinsaltz was a remarkable rabbi who passed away, unfortunately, recently, who worked very hard to coalesce all of these various kinds of explanatory commentaries. And instead of putting them on the side of the perimeter, which is traditional, built them into the actual translation itself. But we just have to understand that the words of the rabbis of the Mishnah is really only what you're seeing here in the bold. Everything else is coming from a combination of Rashi and Rashi's grandchildren, who are known as the Tosafot, and their students, etc. Right? So we get a lot of commentary in here, but it helps us as the modern reader to be able to get really down to what it is that's actually being described here. Okay? So we're told, right, it's any booth that was created 30 days or more prior to the festival, with caveat, of course, without expressly designating that it was for the mitzvah of sukkah. In this case, right, or that case, the assumption is that a person constructed it for some other purpose. However, if they established it expressly for the sake of the festival of Sukkot, even if that had been constructed at the beginning of the previous year, it is fit for use in the fulfillment of the mitzvah of Sukkot. Okay, even according to Beit Shammai, we're told. So here, I'm going to pull back for a second. The text is probably less useful at this point. Here's actually what makes for a very interesting kind of conversation. Okay, and what is this really all about? If you built something, and that's something, right, as I said, a structure in the backyard to make things sort of convenient, or perhaps you have a structure in the backyard that you use for other kinds of things, and then in Sukkot, you just, kind of convert over. What is it that is potentially lost in that process, right? What is it that Shammai is concerned about? Any guesses?
The meaning, the devotion to the holiday, the meaning, the fulfillment of
Excellent.
that.
Excellent, right? That if one is not building the thing with a conscientiousness about why you're building it and what it's connected to, then it just becomes what? Basically, right? Yeah. Any other structure. Okay. It could look like a sukkah, right? It could follow all the other descriptive pieces of the sukkah. And yet we run into a real serious problem, which is if the thing itself really isn't about, right, the mitzvah of Sukkah, if it's not about sort of making sure that we're in the mindset of what Sukkot is all about, then it becomes, remember that earlier conversation I had about the difference between chol, right, the everyday kind of stuff, and kadosh, right, sanctity. So here we actually have what is a narrow conversation that actually has a much broader application in terms of understanding Jewish ritual practice around a lot of things, right? That how we think about it, and not just how we think about it, when we do it, has a big, big, big impact, right, on the expectations of how we fulfill the mitzvot. In particular, the idea of when. So this becomes, again, a much larger conversation, which we won't get into in great detail tonight, right, about the idea of commandments, mitzvot, that are time-bound, that are associated with a particular either day or series of days or time of day, right, or even in some cases, something that only happens in a generation or perhaps in several generations. There was one thing, I forget, it's called Birkat HaLevana, if I remember correctly. It's this really interesting thing that only happens like basically in most of our cases once in a lifetime. And it happened to be when I was in Jerusalem and my brother Jonah dragged me up there at like some ungodly hour to go on top of a roof to do some prayer that I don't even remember exactly what it was. But so you have even those kind of level obscure things. But then you have things like Sukkot that come around year after year after year, right? And we would think, okay, it's year after year, it's rote, we do it every time, right? Why not just make a sukkah and have a permanent sukkah in the backyard, and then we go out and do it, right? Because the building piece of it, and in particular the building piece of it in close temporal proximity to the holiday itself, deepens our connection to the experience, right? And if we remember my earlier comments about one of the challenges that the rabbis faced in a post-destruction, post-exilic world, right? Exilic world, I should say, right? A world of diaspora, a world in which our ancestors were no longer tilling the ground, were no longer bringing offerings to Jerusalem, right? Is how do you create a sense of connection to a both historical event and a historical idea that's not part of your milieu, right? How do we have any kind of way of understanding what it was like for our ancestors to participate in this festival? And so a lot of the things that the rabbis do to build restrictions really and limitations and in some ways directions about how to build a sukkah, which are not in the Torah at all, right? That are not described in the Torah in any detail whatsoever, really. They go into such great detail about it because in the process of learning all of these little details, right? In the process of, for example, like in my case, growing up and it being a really fun part of my childhood, right? Helping my parents to build the sukkah, to decorate it, to take it back down again, right? To go outside and eat, right? All of these performative acts have a real pedagogic intention to them. And if you short circuit it, right? You go the easy route. You say, I'm going to do the thing that's most convenient, not the thing that's most meaningful. That really, in essence, is actually a concern of both Shammai and Hillel, right? Hillel is just basically saying, and this is where actually I can give you a personal example of what ends up being the decision about all this, is, and it's indicated in the text that we have. It doesn't say that you can't build a sukkah ahead of time, but it says that you have to build the sukkah. If you build it ahead of time, you have to designate that that thing, that structure is only for one purpose. It is only a sukkah. It is only to be used for ritual purposes on Sukkot and for nothing else. That is not intended to be, a cabana, it's not intended to be, a place to send the kids. It's not a tent to camp in, right? It has a real intense purpose. So the reason I can say this sort of personally, I wish that I still had a picture of it. When my family had a house, they used to have a house in Bridgehampton when I was growing up. And they built the house, on the property. So I remember it being built. And my parents asked a friend of theirs who was a wonderful architect, if I'm remembering the story correctly, to build basically what in effect was a basic structure of a sukkah, right? Posts, beams, right? Everything minus basically the walls and the ceiling. Okay. And so it was already ready there. And every year, basically, all we would end up doing is they created, my mom decorated some plywood boards that we would nail onto the sides to create the walls. And we would put up the lattice and put up the schach, right? And we would be able to have this incredible experience outside. But, when I first studied this text and I thought initially, what we were doing was wrong, right? That we created this structure outside and, who knows what it was for. And then I realized that actually my folks were very conscientious about it, that when they created it, it really had that intention. It wasn't meant for other things. We didn't, use it for other kinds of stuff. It really was a constant reminder of Sukkot throughout the year. And it really was a fascinating kind of thing because it's very rare to experience these things, right? Most people, if they build a sukkah, they build it with a kit, they build it with wood, they build it with, something that they have, and that's it. And, it makes sense, right? Because you want things to be special. You want them to happen in their moment, right? You want them to feel like there is something distinct about them. And one of the things that I think we do really well as Jews, especially on holidays and especially on festivals, is to really dig down into this idea of what makes something kadosh and what makes something chol. It doesn't mean that kadosh is best and chol is bad. It just means that sometimes the only way you can understand something is special is to know that the rest of the time is really, more quotidian, more daily, more regular, right? And it's such a wonderful thing to engender in people, right? Because it almost automatically builds in a sense of gratitude and, uniqueness and specialization to the experience, because, you can't just do it whenever you want to, right? You can't make Sukkot happen in February. Okay. You can't make Shabbat happen on a Tuesday. Okay. And the truth is we struggle with this, right? As moderns, because all of these things usually are inconvenient to our regular pattern of life, right? Shabbat is oftentimes inconvenient, right? I want to go to that football game, right? I want to go to this party. I want to, do all these kinds of things, right? Or, Sukkot is a classic example, right? It can throw off an entire week of your life, and you just went through the holidays, right? So you say, well, why don't we just do this next week, or we'll do the Seder, at some other convenient time. And it's not I'm not trying to be flippant about it, right? It's really much more to say that when we do those things, or when we have that kind of mindset, right, of trying to make Judaism fit into our calendar as opposed to the other way around, I think that Shammai and Hillel were both kind of concerned about that reality all those years ago, as were many of the rabbis, right? Is to say that actually one of the great gifts that Rabbinic Judaism gave to us was really actually holding on to this idea and drilling down even further of the idea of sacred time and of sacred place, and that those things are not generally interchangeable. They happen when they happen, and we have to make occasion to make those occasions special. And while, again, my folks may have been technically okay with creating that, structure, the reality is one of the great joys of the holiday is actually getting involved, actually building your own sukkah, sitting in it, having the meal, inviting friends in, all of those kinds of things that I think really are, again, we're not necessarily a major part of the intention of what the Torah describes, but for the rabbis becomes really, really, really important, right? And you see this happen not just with Sukkot. You see this happen with Pesach as well, right? Pesach in its original form really was a lot like Sukkot. It was a pilgrimage holiday, right? People would come to Jerusalem. The sacrifice of the Paschal Lamb was really the big event, right? The Seder is a much later creation, and it's an attempt to sort of create a kind of walking through of the experience. And the Sukkah is very much the same idea, right? It's to help us in every generation to feel connected to the story of our people, especially in an era where they really were vulnerable, really were exposed, and yet at the same time, incredibly grateful. And I think that, when we think about Hillel and Shammai's disagreement and what it is that they argue, and let me just tell you, this is the smallest part of all of the arguments. It goes on for pages and pages and pages. How tall can it be? How short can it be? Can your feet be technically out of it, but the rest of your body be in of it, and you still be fulfilling the mitzvah, right? All of these things are conversations that the rabbis have because they want to make sure that they're doing it to the best possible effect. Yes, please, Linda, jump in.
Did they know back then, the Israelites know back then how to build it and what to use?
Well, yes, only
what did
because
they do?
Well, only because it was actually normative for them, right? So to basically, a sukkah in essence is an attempt to create what was the sort of natural home of at that point, nomadic people, right? Or not a nomadic, but a traveling people through the desert, right? Is that they were used to basically using what was around, creating a structure that they could sleep in and reside in, packing it back up again and being able to move, right? Generally speaking, the story in the Sinai, there are a few places where they end up encamping for longer periods of time. But for the remainder of it, they largely, including the Mishkan itself, right, were designed to be sort of taken down, put back up again, taken down, put back up again. So that's part of the reason why the Torah likely doesn't go into great descriptions about length and height and depth and material. And it simply says, you are meant to be in a booth for 7 days. Go have a good time, right? But the rabbis, of course, remember, they're not living in one place, right? Jews in Babylonia, Jews in Egypt, Jews in Rome, right? Jews as far flung as a million other places. Most of those places, by the way, not having the same kinds of building materials, not having the same kinds of, things. So that's, part of the reason why, again, a sukkah in our part of the world versus a sukkah, perhaps, right, in Israel, can have all of the similar kinds of structures, right? 3 sides, not 4 coverings that still allow us to see this, the stars at nighttime and the sun, or at least the clouds during the day. And yet at the same time, the schach, right, the covering, can be very different, right? In the Northeast, you tend to see pine boughs. These days, bamboo has become very popular, so you see bamboo a lot. But I can guarantee you this much: the Jews who are celebrating Sukkot in Babylonia and the Jews who are celebrating Sukkot in Israel were not using bamboo. Okay, that much we can be certain of. So, part of it is to say that the rabbis also had to plan in such a way and instruct in such a way that no matter where you were living, that you can make it work, right? And you can make it happen. So that's why, even again, right, in the shtetls, in the tenements, on the very crowded streets of Jerusalem, right, you find ways to create sukkahs that are both large and very, very small, right? And that suit the needs of an entire family or suit the needs of an individual. But the key idea of it, again, is to treat the time as unique and sacred. And even though you can be technically allowed, according to the decision of the rabbis, to build in advance, that if you're going to build it in advance, you have to be very clear that what you're doing has one purpose. It's a sukkah. It's nothing else. It is used for Sukkot and nothing else. And that's why actually eventually a tradition evolved, and it's really actually less of a tradition. It's almost really halacha, that we're meant not to wait to do mitzvahs that we know we have to do, that we're actually supposed to run out and do them as quickly as we can. So the tradition is that actually as soon as Yom Kippur is over, even if you don't go finish the sukkah itself, you go begin the process right away. That's sort of the traditional approach. And most people build them between end of Yom Kippur and the beginning of Sukkot. And just so you know, technically, if you're interested in getting involved in the sukkah game and you haven't yet built yours, and the holiday is starting tonight, the rabbis actually say that in the intervening days, the Chol HaMoed days, if you have not built your sukkah, or if you built your sukkah and it collapsed for some reason, which tends to happen to us a lot, you can rebuild it on the days that are in the in-between so that you can continue to fulfill the mitzvah. All right. So I know this was sort of a lot to throw at you all at once, but just to know, there's a lot to study, there's a lot to learn. And the Sefaria website that Lisa was talking about, you can get right into it really quickly. You can go into the search terms and just write the word sukkah in, and it will show you all kinds of text, all sorts of things that will be of interest to you. And it really, I have a hard relationship with this holiday now that I'm a rabbi, because, every rabbi in the country, once they're finished with Yom Kippur, they could just use a little bit of a break, but at the same time, when I was a kid, Sukkot was, easily, if it wasn't my favorite, it was my second favorite holiday, largely because of those memories of both when we had the house out here and building and sitting and eating in that sukkah, but also, on 91st Street in Central Park West, on the porch of my parents' apartment to this day, they build a sukkah right there. My brother, my niece, the last word, my niece Bina was born during Sukkot, and my brother and my sister-in-law were living in an apartment on, I think, 102nd. It was like a brownstone, and they were on like the second floor or the third floor back. And so they had a teeny porch, and somehow or another, amongst the baby being born and everything else, my brother built this like lean-to sukkah. And I still remember looking at it thinking, oh my God, this thing's going to collapse on all of us. But he did it, and it worked. And, and that's the mindset, right? Is that it's not always going to be perfect. And actually, Sukkot is really not about perfection, but if you can find a way to do it and find a way to celebrate the holiday with a lot of love, that's really what we're shooting for. And that's really what the holiday's about. All right. Well, thank you guys for participating in that piece.
Thank you.
And my pleasure. I loved it. That's why I like, nice, sort of slow kinds of nights like this. You get to move a little bit slower and teach, which is great. All right. So I'm just going to mute everybody again. We're going to end our service with a few things. Let me get back to speaker view here. Maybe I'll leave the sukkah up for the remainder. But we'll turn now to page 586 at the bottom of the page, Aleinu L'Shabeach. And again, your choice of whether you choose to rise or not. Aleinu L'Shabeach Ladon HaKol Latet Gedula Liotzer Breshit Shelo Asanu Kegoye Ha'aratzot Ben Lo Samanu Kemishpachot Adama Shelo Sam Chelkenu Kahem Megor Aleinu Kechol Hamonam ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא. We're now on page 591. ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד Ushemo echad. I'll just ask, is anybody saying Kaddish tonight? Anybody observing yard site saying Kaddish? Okay, so I think we probably actually won't do it tonight then if there's nobody actually to say it for in this case, but certainly if you're thinking of your loved ones tonight, remember there is this beautiful tradition in what's called ushpizin, where when you go in to eat your meal, you welcome in traditionally speaking, the patriarchs and the matriarchs, right, as sort of as spiritual guests, so to speak, within the sukkah. But it broadened out as an idea of thinking about loved ones or thinking about mentors or teachers or people of meaning And so this is a good holiday, especially with Yizkor towards the back end of it, to be remembering our loved ones, whether they passed recently or in previous years. So I want to just, before we conclude with Kiddush, maybe we'll sing Ivdu just, for something as a closing song. Just a reminder again that services tomorrow are at 10 a.m. I know it's confusing everybody that Saturday mornings are 9:30 for a good reason. But our festival services, since we don't have a Torah study afterwards, will be at 10 o'clock. So you can live stream that, Facebook, website, YouTube, whatever you prefer. And I think we may have indicated on the page that it wasn't in person also, but I think if anybody, was coming, it would be at the chapel. I think Howard's going to come help me out if nothing else. But otherwise, certainly we hope you'll join us. And just a reminder again that next week, the end of Sukkot becomes an additional, it's a really interesting conversation, which I'll save for Shabbat, so make sure we all understand it. But what we would refer to in the diaspora generally as two separate holidays connected to each other. One that's called Shmini Atzeret, another that's called Simchat Torah. But in Israel, and in the case of Reform movements, in most cases, where we don't celebrate 2 days of the festival at the ends, we don't have 2 days of Yantif, the holidays combine basically into one thing. So Shmini Atzeret, Simchas Torah with a slash. But Shmini Atzeret is the actual holiday. Simchas Torah is a creation of the rabbis by later generations. Shmini Atzeret, it actually says it in the Torah. And just as a last word, there's a very cute midrash that says that it's really like the idea of Shmini Atzeret is that we're having such a great time, and the holiday is coming to an end, and God's self is enjoying it as well, and doesn't want the people to go back to their regular kind of thing just yet. And so there's a parable of saying it's like a king who invites his children to come back for a feast, and then they're about to go home to their respective homes. And he basically creates the circumstance to keep him around for one more day. So it's I just love that image. I just think it's a great thing, to associate with it. But in any case, I hope you'll join us for some or all of that. Certainly Shabbat services. Again, back to our 6 o'clock Friday night service and 9:30 on Saturday morning. And lastly, if you're in the area, the sukkah, thanks to Bob, is in fact set up. It's at the Whalers Church. It's towards the back of the building. There is a little parking lot on the back side. You could also just park in the main lot and walk along, and you kind of can't miss it. And if you don't see it, then you're probably just on the other side of the building, so just keep walking around. And by tomorrow, we're going to put out a set of a lulav etrog and blessings. So you can come by anytime. You can use it for a meal. You can use it to say the blessings. And the only thing we ask is just basically that if there's another family or people who are waiting, to let them in. And obviously you can't, even if you wanted to, you couldn't pack that many people in it to begin with, but it's really designed for either an individual or an individual family. And you're welcome to use it, join it, whenever you want to throughout the holiday. It is yours. So with that, we'll turn to page 386, and we're going to do Kiddush, again, page 386. And a reminder for Kiddush on festivals, we avoid in this case anything that is about Shabbat, because it's not Shabbat, and we add the special words in that indicate that it's Sukkot and not Pesach or Shavuot or Atzer. Okay? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri hagafen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'am v'romamanu mikol lashon v'kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'titen lanu Adonai Eloheinu mi'ava moadim l'simcha chagim uzmanim l'sason et yom chag hasukot hazeh Zman simchatenu mikra kodesh zecher l'tziat mitzrayim ki banu v'acharta ve'otanu kidashta mikol amim u'moadei kodshecha b'simcha v'sason inchaltanu baruch atah Adonai mekadesh Yisrael v'hazmanim. And then because it's the first night, we add baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shecheyanu v'kiyemanu v'gihanu Lazman Hazeh. Amen. We can unmute and wish each other a Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.
And as I realized this, it's funny. I changed the name on my profile thing here to say Chag Sameach so that when I turned my video off, it would say Chag Sameach. But then I realized I never changed it back. So officially, my name is now Rabbi Chag Sameach. And, that's it. But I hope you guys have a wonderful Chag. And remember, most important thing is besimcha. Okay, do it joyfully, whatever you're doing. And if you can't even get to a sukkah, focus on the mindset piece of it, right? Focus on the intention piece of it. Make it joyful. Okay, do whatever you can. Make it joyful. Certainly, it's been joyful start for me seeing all you guys here, and we hope others who are watching on the stream. I know Sue and Larry, for sure, we know we're watching, which is great. And thanks for enduring my silly kind of background here. But,
Oh, yes.
I loved it. It was
It
wonderful.
was great.
It's really great. So I really thank you guys, and
Thank you,
I
guys.
hope we'll
Thank
get
you.
a chance to see. And Nicole, if David's right there behind you, I hope I'll see you around the neighborhood. But David, Chag Sameach.
I'm Sameach.
Thanks,
All right,
guys.
Take care. We'll see you
Have a
soon.
good evening, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, guys.